It began almost a century ago when the League of Nations was born out of the ashes of the First World War. Its mission was noble, prevent war, protect the weak, and give humanity a forum for peace. But when Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy marched into Ethiopia, and when Hitler tore through Europe, the League stood by powerless and irrelevant. Within 2 decades, it collapsed, and the world plunged into an even greater catastrophe. That collapse gave birth to the United Nations in 1945, an institution built on the promise that such failure would never happen again. For 80 years, the UN has stood as humanity's shield calming conflicts, delivering aid, eradicating diseases, and giving hope to millions. Yet today, as we mark its 80th anniversary, the same haunting question arises: has the UN itself drifted into the same dangerous irrelevance that destroyed its predecessor? Around us, the signs are hard to ignore. Wars rage in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, the Sahel, and beyond. Climate disasters grow fiercer, inequality deepens, and the world economy punishes the poor while rewarding the wealthy. The Security Council, frozen in the power arrangements of 1945, often fails to act. And once more, nations are beginning to wonder if the United Nations can still deliver on its founding promise to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This is not just a debate for diplomats in New York. It is a question that will shape whether your grandchildren grow up in a world of peace or in a world torn apart by chaos and mistrust. If the UN cannot adapt, who will protect the vulnerable, respond to pandemics, or stand guard when war threatens? And if Africa, the continent that provides most of the peacekeepers, suffers most of the conflicts, and yet has no permanent seat at the table, continues to be ignored, can the UN claim to represent humanity at all? Do you believe the United Nations can truly survive without Africa's voice? Please share your thoughts below. And if you feel that the truth of Africa's struggle for justice must be heard, subscribe, because this is a story the headlines will not tell you. History has a way of warning us before it repeats itself. When the League of Nations failed to stop aggression in the 1930s, the world paid the price with the devastation of the Second World War. That collapse forced the birth of the United Nations in 1945, meant to be stronger, more inclusive, and determined never to repeat the same mistakes. 8 decades later, as leaders gather to mark the UN's 80th anniversary, the uncomfortable truth is clear: the same cracks that doomed the League are beginning to show once again. The United Nations has much to be proud of. For nearly a century, it has stood as humanity's most ambitious experiment in global cooperation. UN peacekeepers wearing their iconic blue helmets have patrolled battlefields from Cambodia to Liberia, often risking their lives to keep fragile peace. Its agencies have provided food in famine-stricken Horn of Africa villages, shelter for millions of Syrian and Ukrainian refugees, and protection for children caught in the crossfire of wars. The eradication of smallpox, global vaccination campaigns, and coordinated responses to Ebola and COVID-19 all carried the UN's signature. Few institutions in history can claim such a legacy. And yet, despite these achievements, the question of relevance now hangs heavy. The Security Council remains frozen in the power dynamics of 1945, when the victorious Allied powers divided permanent authority among themselves. That structure has not shifted, even as the world has changed dramatically. Entire continents, Africa, with 54 nations, and Latin America, with over 600 million people, remain locked out of permanent representation. Resolutions are passed, but too often ignored. Calls for peace in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and the Sahel are drowned out by the rivalries of great powers. The UN's blue helmets, once symbols of moral authority, no longer inspire the same respect. Beyond the battlefield, the cracks extend to the financial system the UN was meant to oversee. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, created in the same post-war moment, remain dominated by wealthy shareholders. Kenya's president reminded the world that during the IMF's last allocation of special drawing rights, 64% went to wealthy countries that did not need the funds, while the poorest nations received just 2.4%. The very institutions meant to stabilize economies are instead reinforcing inequality. For African nations, this means higher interest rates, harsher conditions, and a cycle of debt that traps generations. At the same time, the threats of the 21st century have outpaced the UN's ability to respond. Climate disasters grow fiercer each year, from flooding in Libya to drought across the Horn of Africa. Pandemics loom as new diseases outpace global preparedness. Inequality deepens as billions remain excluded from opportunity, even as technology reshapes entire societies. Instead of solidarity, mistrust and fragmentation dominate international politics. And yet amid this turbulence, Africa continues to bear the heaviest cost while being given the smallest voice. The continent dominates the Security Council's agenda, provides some of the largest peacekeeping contingents, and shoulders the burden of instability. But when decisions are made about sanctions, interventions, or global finance, Africa remains absent from the permanent table. This is not only unfair, it undermines the very credibility of the United Nations. That is why on this 80th anniversary, African leaders are once again reminding the world of the Isilwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, historic positions that call for at least 2 permanent seats for Africa with full rights, including the veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats. For 20 years, this demand has been repeated, ignored, or endlessly debated. But as Kenya's president declared, Africa will no longer wait on the margins of global governance. This is the heart of the event at the UN's 80th session, not just a commemoration, but a reckoning. If the United Nations wants to remain relevant, it must reform. If it fails, it risks becoming what the League of Nations once was, an institution remembered for its ideals, but powerless in its actions. The tension in the General Assembly reached its peak when Kenya's president moved beyond history and theory to hard evidence. He chose Haiti as his case study, a nation long synonymous with despair, now suddenly a stage for hope. For years, the people of Haiti cried out to the international community as gangs took over neighborhoods, schools, even government buildings. Too often, their pleas were met with hesitation, underfunded missions, or half-hearted gestures. When Kenya stepped forward to lead the multinational security support mission, it did so with limited resources, less than 40% of the authorized personnel strength, inadequate equipment, and minimal logistical backing from the UN. On paper, the mission was destined to fail, and yet against all odds, Haiti began to change. The presidential palace, once surrounded by gang rule, was restored as the seat of government. Police headquarters and the National Academy were reclaimed, with over 700 new officers graduating to protect their people. Schools reopened after years of violence, giving children a chance to learn again. Roads once barricaded by gangs saw traffic flowing freely. Even the airport and seaport lifelines for any nation returned to normal operations. The message was clear: if so much could be achieved in just 15 months with stretched resources, imagine what could have been accomplished if the United Nations had acted with full solidarity. The Haitian mission became both an inspiring story of resilience and a stinging indictment of global neglect. From that point, the speech pivoted sharply into Africa's demand. Africa will no longer wait on the margins of global governance, the president declared. It was a line that drew murmurs across the hall. The continent that provides the soldiers, that hosts the conflicts, and that sacrifices the most is demanding not charity, but justice. 2 permanent seats on the Security Council with veto powers and 2 additional non-permanent seats. Anything less, the president insisted, would be a betrayal of both Africa and the founding promise of the United Nations. This was the high point, the emotional and political climax. The comparison was inescapable. Just as the League of Nations collapsed when it lost credibility, so too could the UN if it continues to ignore Africa's voice. It is not simply a matter of fairness, it is a matter of survival. Without reform, the UN risks becoming irrelevant in the 21st century, unable to stop wars, unable to inspire trust, unable to live up to its own charter. The reaction was immediate. For African delegates, the words carried the weight of decades of frustration finally spoken aloud. For Western powers, the demands landed like a direct challenge to the old order established in 1945. Some nodded, acknowledging the undeniable logic. Others shifted uneasily, knowing that granting Africa permanent seats would alter the balance of global power in ways they had long resisted. But the climax did not end there. The president went further, pointing to the global financial system as another pillar in need of reform. The IMF and World Bank, he argued, are relics of an era when Europe was rebuilding after World War II. Today, they punish poor nations with high interest rates and crippling conditions while rewarding wealthy countries with softer terms. The injustice was laid bare in a single statistic: 64% of the IMF's special drawing rights went to countries that did not even need the funds, while the poorest received just 2.4%. This dual indictment of the Security Council and of the financial system formed the thunderclap of the address. The implication was unmistakable: if the world's most important institutions cannot reform Africa, and the global South will not sit idle. They will build their own banks, their own alliances, their own structures of governance that reflect today's realities rather than the frozen hierarchies of 1945. It was here that the hall sat in silence, aware that they were not just listening to another ceremonial speech. They were witnessing Africa's boldest warning, yet reform the system or watch it crumble. When the debate shifts from lofty speeches to the lives of ordinary people, the consequences of an ineffective United Nations become painfully clear. For millions, the failures of global governance are not abstract, they are lived realities. Consider the child in Port-au-Prince whose school closed for years because gangs turned classrooms into barracks. Or the farmer in the Sahel who watches his crops wither under relentless drought while the world struggles to deliver meaningful climate action. Or the mother in Gaza or Sudan desperately searching for food shelter and safety as bombs fall and aid convoys stall in political deadlock. For these people, the question of whether the United Nations reforms itself is not about diplomacy, it is about survival. If the UN continues to resist change, the political and civil consequences will multiply. First, its legitimacy will erode further. Nations will bypass New York and form regional alliances to solve crises on their own terms. We already see this trend, the African Union mobilizing peacekeeping forces, the alliance of Sahel states forming military coalitions, and regional financial institutions rising to replace IMF dependency. While these efforts may empower local actors, they also risk fragmenting the world order into competing blocs, leaving no single forum where humanity can speak with one voice. Second, without reform, global inequalities will deepen. The existing financial architecture forces poor nations into perpetual debt traps. High interest rates and rigid conditionalities mean governments cannot invest in schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. Civil society bears the brunt, young people without jobs, families without healthcare, and communities without stability. This is how instability breeds extremism, migration crises, and endless cycles of violence. The absence of a fair representative UN accelerates these dangers. Third, the symbolic cost is immense. The United Nations was created to embody the idea that humanity could rise above nationalism and power politics. If Africa, home to overrun 4 billion people, the fastest-growing youth population, and some of the richest resources on Earth, remains excluded from real decision-making, then the very principle of universality collapses. What message does that send to the next generation? That justice is selective, that power once gained is never shared. Such cynicism corrodes faith not only in the UN, but in democracy and international law itself. On the other hand, the potential benefits of reform are transformative. Granting Africa permanent seats on the Security Council would not just satisfy a moral claim, it would improve decision-making. African states already carry the weight of peacekeeping missions, and conflict resolution. Securing their voices would make responses faster, more legitimate, and more grounded in reality. Similarly, reforming financial institutions to provide affordable lending would unleash development across the global south, reducing the very crises, migration, poverty, instability that preoccupy wealthier nations. For ordinary citizens, this would translate into tangible improvements: children in school instead of refugee camps, farmers supported with climate-smart agriculture instead of abandoned to drought, families rebuilding their communities instead of fleeing across deserts and seas. The civil and political stakes of reform, therefore, are not just about institutional design, they are about the dignity and future of billions. The warning is stark: without reform, the United Nations risks sliding into irrelevance, remembered only as another League of Nations, an institution that failed to rise to its moment. With reform, it could once again become humanity's shield, a place where justice is not selective and where every voice, including Africa's, carries equal weight. From Washington's perspective, the United Nations has long been both an instrument of influence and a burden of responsibility. The United States hosts the UN headquarters, contributes billions in funding, and wields a permanent veto on the Security Council. Yet it also faces growing skepticism, both abroad and at home, about whether the institution serves America's interests or undermines them. For many in the U.S., especially older generations who remember the Cold War, the UN symbolizes stability. It was within this chamber that nuclear treaties were negotiated, sanctions were enforced, and humanitarian missions were coordinated. But in recent years, American leaders have grown frustrated. They see paralysis on the Security Council, constant criticism of U.S. allies, and a rising chorus of demands, especially from Africa and the Global South, for reform that could dilute Washington's power. This is the dilemma. If America supports reform, it risks sharing influence with new players, particularly African states, that may align with China, Russia, or independent regional blocs. If it resists reform, it fuels the perception that the U.S. is clinging to an outdated hierarchy, undermining its own credibility as a champion of democracy and fairness. For a country that prides itself on moral leadership, this tension is becoming harder to reconcile. Beyond America, the global picture is equally complex. In Europe, many governments remain cautious about reform, fearing that a stronger Africa or Latin America would weaken their relative weight. France and the United Kingdom, both permanent Security Council members, face mounting pressure to justify why their wartime victories in 1945 still grant them special privileges nearly a century later. Meanwhile, emerging powers in Asia and Latin America, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, watch Africa's struggle closely, knowing that its success would set a precedent for their own demands. For Africa itself, the debate is not theoretical. It is existential. The continent contributes the majority of peacekeepers, suffers the highest number of conflicts, and provides vital resources to the global economy from cobalt and gold to agricultural exports. Yet, when decisions are made about sanctions, interventions, or climate finance, Africa is consulted last. This exclusion has global consequences. When people in the Sahel or Horn of Africa lose faith in international justice, they migrate, protest, or turn to alternative alliances. The ripple effects reach European shores, American politics, and global markets. Even rivals like China and Russia see opportunity in this moment. By presenting themselves as champions of Africa's inclusion, they weaken Western dominance while gaining allies in the global South. In effect, every year that reform is delayed, the geopolitical map tilts further away from U.S. and European leadership. This is why the UN at 80 matters not just for Africa, but for the entire world order. For the United States, the choice is stark: embrace reform and strengthen the UN as a platform for collective action, or resist change and watch its legitimacy fade, opening the door for competitors to write the rules instead. For Europe, the choice is similar: cling to wartime privileges or adapt to a multipolar reality. The world is watching, and the verdict will shape not only Africa's place at the table, but the credibility of the United Nations itself. 80 years ago, the United Nations was born from the ashes of war with a simple but profound promise that humanity could govern itself through dialogue rather than destruction. Today, on its 80th anniversary, that promise is under its greatest test. The world does not face a single crisis. It faces many at once: wars raging from Gaza to Ukraine, climate disasters striking every continent, pandemics looming, and inequality tearing societies apart. Yet the very institution designed to confront these challenges now risks being paralyzed by outdated structures and selective justice. The warning could not be clearer. History has already shown us what happens when international institutions lose legitimacy. The League of Nations collapsed into irrelevance, and the world plunged into catastrophe. If the United Nations refuses to reform, if it continues to ignore the voices of entire continents like Africa, it will meet the same fate. And this time, the cost may be even greater: not just another war, but the unraveling of the global system itself. But there is also hope. Reform is still possible. By opening its doors to Africa, by giving every region a fair stake in decision-making, and by reshaping financial institutions to serve the many rather than the few, the UN can renew itself. It can become once again the shield it was meant to be, protecting the vulnerable, amplifying the powerless, and keeping humanity from sliding into chaos. This is not only a matter for diplomats in New York, it is a question for all of us. Because whether you live in Ouagadougou, New York, or Nairobi, the consequences of failure will reach your doorstep through rising costs, refugee flows, climate shocks, or conflict spilling across borders. In an interconnected world, no nation can afford to stand alone. So I leave you with this question: do you believe the United Nations can truly survive without Africa's full voice at the table, or are we already witnessing the beginning of its decline? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters in this global conversation. And if you believe that Africa's struggle for justice must be heard, that President Ibrahim Traoré and other African leaders are speaking truths the world can no longer ignore, then make sure to subscribe. Because in this space, we believe the truth is always more important than the headlines.